All right, let's jump right into this brand new explainer on the International Energy Agency's Electricity 2026 report. Guys, we are looking at a massive, and I mean absolutely massive turning point in human infrastructure right now. We're officially entering what the IEA is calling the age of electricity. And the sheer scale of the shift we're about to unpack today, it's basically going to reshape the entire global economy over the next 5 years.
So it really brings up the defining question of our time, right? What actually happens when the world unplugs from fossil fuels and plugs into literally everything else? Between our push for cleaner energy and this insane explosion in technology, we're seeing an unprecedented surge in power demand. We're electrifying our cars, our heating, our heavy industry, and, of course, building these massive data centers to power AI. And as you'll see in a minute, this is putting some incredible, sweat-inducing stress on the systems we rely on every single day. Section 1. The Age of Electricity. Okay, so for decades, there was this pretty simple historical rule of thumb. Electricity demand almost perfectly mirrored the economy. If global GDP went up, electricity demand went up right alongside it at basically the same pace. But actually, scratch that. That 30-year rule is officially broken. Starting this year in 2024 and zooming right through to 2030, electricity demand is just vastly outpacing economic growth. It's climbing at a brisk 3.6% every single year. To put that into perspective for you, electricity consumption is now projected to grow at least 2.5 times as fast as overall energy demand. That is a total game changer. Section 2. The Global Power Eaters. So with demand growing this fast, who exactly is eating up all this new power? Well, you might immediately think it's heavy industry taking the lion's share, but look at that massive 49% slice. That's the building sector. And the absolute main culprits driving this massive surge within that sector are AI data centers, heat pumps, and a major spike in air conditioning thanks to those intense global heat waves we've been having. At the same time, the transport sector, fueled by everyone buying EVs, is basically doubling its historical share, accounting for over 10% of this new demand growth. And when we look at the map, the numbers are honestly just as staggering. Emerging economies are scooping up nearly 80% of this new demand. To put this into a relatable scale, over the next 5 years, China alone, just China, is adding new electricity demand equivalent to the entire European Union's current total consumption. Let that sink in. That is an astonishing build-out of infrastructure, growing at almost 5% a year. Meanwhile, we're seeing a massive shift in the developed world, too. For 15 long years, advanced economies saw their electricity demand essentially just flatline, mostly thanks to energy efficiency gains and changes in industry. But they are officially waking up from that 15-year slumber. The United States recently saw its demand rise by over 2%, and it's projected to keep growing nearly 2% annually all the way through 2030. And you guessed it, around half of that total increase in the U.S. is driven heavily by the rapid, almost frantic expansion of data centers. Section 3. Half clean by 2030. So, the big question, how on earth are we going to supply all this new power? Well, by 2030, we're set to hit a massive global milestone. Renewables and nuclear energy combined are going to rise up and meet roughly 50% of the globe's total electricity generation. In fact, over the next 5 years, renewables, nuclear, and natural gas are expected to meet literally all of the additional global electricity demand in aggregate. No way, right? But it's true. The IEA specifically notes this, and I quote, "Total generation from renewables is overtaking coal, growing by about 1,000 terawatt-hours annually." Guys, that represents a blistering 8% annual growth rate just for renewables. Over 600 terawatt-hours of that yearly growth is coming from record-setting solar PV alone. We are watching a fundamental reshaping of how human beings harvest energy in real time. But here's the plot twist. Despite this absolutely unprecedented green boom, coal is stubbornly sticking around. While coal use is definitely dropping in places like Europe and ticking down slightly in China, it's actually seen recent bumps in the US and India. So while renewables are growing incredibly fast to meet all this new demand, coal absolutely refuses to fade entirely, and it's still projected to remain the single largest individual fuel source globally in 2030. Kind of wild, right? Section 4, the Great Grid Bottleneck. Which brings us to the most urgent crisis revealed in the entire report. Think of our power grid like a massive, complex highway system. You can build all the clean energy cars and flashy EVs you want. But right now, the highway on-ramps are closed. Our transmission grids were mostly built for a completely different era, mainly just to handle peak capacity, and grid investment has seriously lagged behind the investment we've put into power generation. We are looking at a massive, sprawling traffic jam that threatens this entire transition.
And this huge number is exactly why. 2,500 gigawatts. That staggering figure represents the amount of renewable energy, battery storage, and large load projects, yeah, like those giant AI data centers, that are currently stalled in grid connection queues all over the world. They're built or they're ready to be built, but they literally cannot plug into the system because the local grids are just too congested. So to fix this physical bottleneck, we have to start pouring capital directly into the wires themselves. Current annual global grid investment sits right around $400 billion. But the IEA forecasts that to actually meet our 2030 demand, that investment needs to jump by roughly 50%. And that has to happen alongside a massive global scale-up of the physical supply chains that actually build the transformers and high-voltage cables.
Section 5. The flexibility fix. Now, you might be wondering, building new transmission lines takes years, right? Sometimes over a decade. So how do we bypass this traffic jam today? Well, we unlock a ton of capacity immediately through policy and tech. Step 1, non-firm connection agreements. These let energy projects connect to the grid way faster, basically under the agreement that their output might be curtailed during absolute peak congestion. That move alone unlocks up to 900 gigawatts. Step 2 is using grid-enhancing technology, things like dynamic line rating and voltage operating. Basically, this is tech that squeezes way more efficiency out of the wires we already have. And that unlocks another 700 gigawatts. Plus, utility-scale batteries are stepping up big time to solve the classic timing issue of renewable energy. Because, sometimes the wind is howling and the sun is blasting when we just don't need the power. So utility-scale batteries in places like California, Germany, South Australia, and Texas are just booming right now. Costs are falling incredibly fast, which makes them the ultimate short-term flexibility tool. We can store that excess energy and deploy it exactly when the grid is screaming for it.
Section 6. The emissions plateau.
Okay, so what does all this crazy infrastructure and skyrocketing demand actually mean for our climate? Well, deep inside the data, there's a really surprising silver lining. Despite massive electricity demand from AI, huge data centers, and millions of new EVs hitting the streets, global power sector emissions have actually stabilized. After ticking up slightly between 2022 and 2024, emissions totally flatlined in 2025, and the IEA forecasts they'll just plateau right through 2030. The clean energy we're adding to the system is successfully absorbing that huge spike in new demand. In fact, looking back over the last decade, we've actually seen a 14% drop in global CO2 intensity. This is absolutely crucial because it proves our electricity is fundamentally decoupling from emissions. Even though we are using drastically more power than ever before, the power we use is getting cleaner every single year as low emissions generation expands.
Which leaves us with the ultimate takeaway from this whole report. The demand is here, the clean energy tech is absolutely ready, and it's being deployed at a totally unprecedented scale to meet that demand. But as we stare down those thousands of gigawatts just stuck waiting in the queue, we have to ask ourselves, is our grid ready? Can our physical nuts and bolts infrastructure actually survive the age of electricity? It's a massive, monumental challenge for sure, but hey, the solutions are on the table. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will see you in the next one.